Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Red Bull are dominating the 2023 season so far, and Christian Horner has revealed that they are actually going to switch all of their focus in the factory to next year's RB20 rather than seriously continuing with this year's RB19. They know both championships are locked up, and this is effectively a way to get around the issues with the penalty they suffered for aerodynamic testing time. They can lock up this year's championship with the current package they have and go all in on next year's car to ensure they maintain an advantage again, and the fact that the penalty didn't really hurt them after all. Very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. This is the championship as it stands. Verstappen is 69 points ahead of Sergio Perez. That is pretty ugly. There's no way that's going to get overturned. Alonso P3, and actually Alonso very confident that he can beat Perez by the end of the season. And right now, you kind of would say that that is the more likely outcome based on recent evidence. And also, if Verstappen didn't exist, as Tomo puts together again, the Drivers' Championship would currently be being led by Fernando Alonso. This is just assuming that Verstappen didn't exist, so everyone gets bumped up a little bit, and Verstappen's fastest lap points go to the second fastest lapped driver, which then works out like this. So Perez would have 5 wins this year, Alonso would have 2, Hamilton would have 2, but Alonso would be currently leading the championship by 1 point, which would be, this championship would be absolutely fantastic, but unfortunately for the competitors in the championship, Verstappen exists, is the best driver on the grid, and is absolutely dominating right now, and is just remarkably consistent. Every weekend he's there, and he's capitalizing on the package that Red Bull have given him. That was also the 100th Grand Prix victory for Red Bull. Verstappen now at 41, Vettel 38, Webber 9, Riccardo 7, Perez 5, and that totals 100, and Verstappen will get plenty more from now to the end of the year. He's also on the verge of breaking some serious records. This was the first time in a long time, since 2012, that a driver had led every single lap for 3 consecutive races. Verstappen's done it on the last 3 Grand Prix. Vettel did it back in 2012. It hasn't happened since then, and there's only been one driver ever that's done it for 4 consecutive races, and that's Alberto Ascari back in 1952 for the France, Britain, Germany, Netherlands Grand Prix respectively. So Max could theoretically join him in Austria. It's not guaranteed. It might be a trickier circuit, and there is a lot of DRS passing potential back and forth in Austria, so who knows what's going to happen there. But yeah, this is a legitimate possibility. You'd think that maybe Hamilton could have managed this at some point, but often during that period, even when Mercedes were dominating with Hamilton Bottas, they'd quite often have a 1-2, and then Hamilton leading the race would get the beneficial pit strategy. They'd bring you into the box. Bottas would come into the box next lap, but it would mean that there was 1 lap of the race that was led by Bottas, but with Perez being nowhere near Verstappen right now, and his time management and the Red Bull's time management being so good, often Verstappen is the last to pit of the top guys, and therefore he ends up leading all the laps, and nearly got the fastest lap this weekend again as well. That also matches Red Bull's best ever winning streak of 9 races in a row. Of course, in 2013, this was all Sebastian Vettel winning all of these, and that is still the record for most race wins in a row. Verstappen's currently on 4, is he not? Ever since Azerbaijan, of course, where Perez won, but they are on 9 Grand Prix wins in a row, which is about to break their all-time record if Verstappen or Perez wins in Austria. And nowadays, with the superior reliability these cars have, it's particularly likely that will continue, and as Hamilton says here, Red Bull are likely to win every single race. It's very hard to catch them with the way the rules are, and it's possible. Will they do it? I think it's doubtful, because what they're likely to do is effectively sacrifice the rest of this year. They're going to win the championships anyway. Their car is, even if Mercedes and Aston bring massive upgrades, and Red Bull keep their car as it is from now to the end of the year, and I still think they've got some other things in the pipeline. I'm pretty sure Verstappen said they've got a new floor coming in a few races time that might give them another couple of tenths. But even if Red Bull were to leave their car as is, they'd probably win the majority of races from now to the end of the season anyway, and they can fully focus on next year's car, and that's where a lot of the discussions are coming in, because last year the penalty, the aerodynamic testing penalty for the budget cap breach, was a massive talking point at the end of last season, and many people said it seems like a bit of a lenient penalty, all things considered. They were likely to start this season out anyway with the fastest car, and yes, internally they've said, and Horner and Pierre Vacher I think has also said, that it will bite them at some point, but they can kind of avoid it biting them if they just don't develop any more for this year. And to be honest, do they need to? They probably don't. Verstappen's miles ahead in the championship. Yes, Alonso might beat Perez to P2, but it doesn't really matter if you're winning both the drivers and the constructors anyway. Alonso is very confident that he can and will overhaul Perez, and right now you'd think that is actually the most likely outcome based on the current trajectory trajectory of the cars, and Perez is very concerned about his pace deficit. It's very strange how Perez, for kind of the second year running, was competitive to Max for a little bit, and then just absolutely falls off a cliff. And in part, Max Verstappen's doing a great job, right? But it's not like Verstappen's extracting time from the Red Bull that doesn't exist in the car. Like, the car is obviously quick, it's obviously the quickest car, and we see what Alonso and Hamilton are doing behind in cars that are nearly as quick but not quite, and Perez is miles behind. Like, it's kind of tragic. One of the hopes that other teams might have is that Adrian Newey might retire at some point, and actually he did mention yesterday after Red Bull's 100th Grand Prix victory that the countdown to his retirement has started. Of course, my career can't go on forever, so I think of it as long as the team want me and I keep enjoying it, I'll stay, but that's got to be, realistically, it's on a countdown. Exactly when the day is, I don't know, but look, he's been around in Formula 1 a long time, and he did say after the 100th win that this effectively starts the countdown to his retirement. It might be 2 years away, it might be 10 years away. Honestly, who knows with this guy, but he's going to be with Red Bull for that time frame. The question is, what's he cooking up in the factory for next year's car? I'll just share the audio of this here from Christian Horner where he says that mostly, and keep in mind, we're at round 9 of the season so far. We are even well before the halfway mark of the season, and Red Bull are already saying most of the focus in the factory right now is on next year's RB20. And you'd imagine within a couple of races, especially by the time the summer break comes around, probably all of the focus is going to be on next year's version.
But with the cost cap, it's more tricky, right? Because you can't just go and spend lots of money on next year's car. So do you keep developing through this year into next year, or how does it work?
Well, it's finding that balance, and because, obviously you have a lot less wind tunnel time, we have to apply that, we have to start thinking a lot about next year. So, you're spinning a couple of plates at the moment, but, with the regulations being stable, whatever you learn this year, you carry into next year as well. So, of course, there are things that we'll still keep bringing to this year's car, but a lot of the focus now back in the factory is already on next year.
So to be honest, this shouldn't be a massive surprise. This is the virtuous cycle, as Ted Kravitz describes it, of having the fastest car. You start out the season the best, you get so many points early on, you don't actually have to develop that hard for the rest of the year, and you can put a lot of your ideas into next year's car. We don't know how many, if there's going to be slight rule changes for next season yet. There's probably going to be a few things they'll tweak around for next season's regulations, but fundamentally, it's going to be pretty similar. Their car right now has the best concept, they expect they can take that slightly higher than they currently are, and they can work harder on next year's car than anybody else can. And this is the issue you get with the testing time, but also the budget cap in general. The teams can't just spend infinite money and infinite time on this year's car. They have to at some point commit to next year's, and Mercedes last year, they put more time into the W13 than they would have liked to, but mainly because they needed to solve some of its issues. They needed to bring the Austin upgrade, for example, that was making them more competitive, just to see, would that idea work for the concept? Once they figured out it would, they thought, all right, sound, we won in Brazil, let's double down on that concept for 2023. Turns out they had the wrong idea, and they had to change their mind on it. But that's eaten into their budget cap, that's eaten into their development time, and this year, Mercedes have almost certainly spent more money than Red Bull up to this point in the season than Red Bull have, in terms of upgrades and development and stuff like that, and Red Bull can happily focus on next year's situation, and that 10% less wind tunnel time penalty sounded significant on paper, possibly, even though I was never particularly convinced, but they almost have the choice how they want to use it. They can still choose how they use their wind tunnel testing time. If they want to say, you know what, this car's good enough, let's just use it for next year's car, they can feel free to do exactly that. And that's been the debate that's being had over the last day or so, is that with Horner effectively admitting they're giving up on this year's car pretty early on and moving on to next year, it's a debate, right? Because the end of this season will likely, as a result of this from Horner, be more interesting and competitive. The last few races, we have seen at the last couple of races, people have been more competitive to Verstappen. They are closing the gap slowly but surely, it seems, to the Red Bull. And maybe Max Verstappen wins the next 10 races in a row. But at the end of the year, around the Brazil time, Austin, Texas or something, you would think that probably a couple of wins go to different teams. But this is also the question that Mercedes have to realise, and they certainly do realise this, that they can't take their eye off the ball of next year's car. And actually Hamilton basically said they need to ensure they do take their eye a little bit off this year's car to ensure that next year's car can be good enough, because they know Red Bull's game, right? They know what Red Bull are doing here. They know their car's great, and Hamilton would be far happier having, losing every race this year to Red Bull and having them wipe the floor clean, and then at least having a competitive car 1-1 next year with Max, rather than win a couple of races at the end of this year. Maybe Mercedes do get a couple of wins on the board. It's certainly possible. But then Verstappen has the fastest car again next year, and it's rinse and repeat, which I don't think anyone really wants to see if you're a fan of a competitive championship. So we'll see how this goes, but it was an interesting admission there from Horner that effectively, yeah, next year's car is now their focus, whereas for probably every other car on the grid, they're still working on this year more than next year's car, but Red Bull have that luxury. What I do wonder, though, is Perez going to be the driver there next year? I don't think he's going to get replaced mid-season, but he has been way off the pace lately. I don't know if the pressure of that championship challenge got to him a bit, but even now, like, his quality, I mean, he's not been in Q3 for the last 3 races. His head-to-head this season is 4-4 in qualifying with Lando Norris in a McLaren. Like, it's not a particularly great sign. Liam Lawson as well has been, I think he had a difficult race in Super Formula recently, but nonetheless, he's still been a top prospect. Even Esteban Ocon says, put me in the Red Bull and I'll fight with Max for the championship. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not what Red Bull want to hear in terms of a, a second driver, and it's for similar reasons why I wouldn't expect them to reach out to Lando Norris and say, hey, because Alex Palou, for example, has been killing it in IndyCar at the moment, and he's dominating that championship right now. He drove very well, actually, I think it was Austin last year in the McLaren, so maybe there's a world in which Lando moves on, Alex Palou comes into that seat, would be an interesting possibility. But yeah, Norris, I'd love to see Norris to Red Bull. I think many people would. Would Red Bull do it? I doubt it. Could Riccardo be the man? That's another possibility. He is there. He has a lot of brand power. Would he do any worse than Perez currently is? I don't think so. I think it might be similar. Maybe Riccardo does a bit better, right? He was very competitive with Verstappen a few years ago, so the Perez storyline is a big one to keep your eyes on, because if Verstappen was starting where Perez did, I think he gets podium minimum, to be honest, right? But Perez just couldn't do it. P6 in the end. Not good enough. 6-2 in Verstappen's favour between those two this season. The most dominant is still Alonso and Tsunoda, but it's actually pretty interesting that there's a couple of key teams in the mix on the upper end of things here. But very much intrigued to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.